It's my pleasure today to introduce a new study from our lab on the shared regulatory pathways amongst multimorbid psychiatric disorders and cognitive functioning. Presenting the work today is Eugenia Golovina.
Psychiatric disorders are very common in our society. In fact, 1 in 7 people worldwide are diagnosed with psychiatric disorders. 2 or more psychiatric disorders usually co-occur together, and there is a hypothesis that basically they may co-occur due to the so-called P factor. And P factor is something that we think can explain the commonalities between these disorders. It's possible that this P factor is in genetics because genetics actually explains 25 to 90% of heritability of these different psychiatric disorders. So we set about trying to understand this. All of the population genetic studies that have been done to date have identified thousands of genetic variants associated with different psychiatric disorders and cognitive functions. And we look at those variants associated with ADHD, anxiety, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, unipolar depression, and cognition. And we ask, are these variants similar and how they may relate to each other? When we look at them, we found that genetic variants were largely not shared among psychiatric disorders and cognition. In fact, most of them were specific to individual phenotypes, and that doesn't really explain the existence of P factor. But genetic variants can mark regions that can control genes, and perhaps if we looked at these genes, then we might find the commonalities among the disorders, because genetic variants can mark regions that can control the same genes. So what we found is, again, the genes are mostly not shared, but there are much more overlaps among the phenotypes that we observed before. But still, most genes were unique to specific phenotypes, which is not in line with the P factor hypothesis. But because genes work within biological pathways, genetic variants associated, let's say, with anxiety can impact genes and then pathways and lead to characteristics specific to anxiety. Exactly the same can happen with a different phenotype, let's say schizophrenia. But in instances when psychiatric disorders co-occur together, we can see that the genes can also co-occur together in the same pathways, and that in turn can explain the shared characteristics between these disorders. So we look at the affected pathways, and we saw 61 biological pathways shared among all 6 phenotypes, and just a few pathways unique to specific phenotype. In fact, that's where we think this P factor can come in. Some of the shared regulatory pathways contribute to different aspects of neurodevelopment. For example, within this pathway, genetic variants associated with schizophrenia affect this gene. At the same time, variants associated with cognition and depression both affect this gene. But both genes can be involved in the regulation of communication and interactions between neuronal cells, which is very important for neurodevelopment. In conclusion, our results may provide support for the P factor hypothesis and highlight key biological pathways for development of therapies that target co-occurring psychiatric disorders. To finish up, I would like to thank the Genomics and System Biology group at Liggins Institute for useful discussions and Terry Lins for his valuable comments. I also would like to acknowledge the New Zealand NESI High Performance Computing Facilities and Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment for funding this work. Thank you.
If you would like any more information, please feel free to contact us at the Liggins Institute.